The probable cause affidavit for the arrest warrant for Bryan Kohberger was just released just a few hours ago, and I know that a lot of people are interested in kind of what it says and how it plays out in a criminal investigation. My name is Michael Rank. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I've been doing criminal defense here in Jacksonville for the last 11 years. I've handled everything from attempted murder, armed robbery, sexual battery, everything in between. I can tell you from personal experience, the affidavit in support of the arrest warrant is 19 pages long, and the Idaho Police Department goes through just extreme detail as to what their investigation was the night of the incident and leading up to the arrest of Mr. Kohberger just a few days ago. To be quite frank with you, the details of the probable cause affidavit, the first few pages are pretty tough to read. You know, they detail the scene that the officers observed when they first walked in, as well as any evidence that they obtained. One of the most, what is going to be one of the most important pieces of evidence that they did receive was a tan leather knife sheath laying to the bed, next to the bed of one of the victims. The sheath was later processed and had K-bar and USMC stamped on the outside of it. USMC obviously standing initials for United States Marine Corps. The Idaho State Lab later located a single source of male DNA left on the button snap of the knife sheath. We don't know whether this is blood, whether this is saliva, whether this is something else. DNA can be left any number of ways. It's not just found in blood, it can be found in other bodily samples such as hair, saliva, blood. However, they were able to isolate a single source of male DNA on that button snap of the knife sheath, and it goes to discuss later on that they were actually able to connect that to Bryan Kohberger. As part, really some of the most disturbing information to come from the affidavit in support of the search warrant is the testimony from one of the roommates who was apparently present at the home when the murders supposedly took place. She said that she originally went to sleep around 4 o'clock in the morning, and she was woken a short time later to what she heard to be thuds of what she thought her roommate to be playing with her dog upstairs. A short time later, she heard what she thought was her roommate saying, "There's someone here." The roommate goes on to state that she opened her door, she didn't see anything, and she closed the door, went back into her room. Again, later on, a short time later, she heard crying coming from her roommate's room, and she stated that she heard a male voice say something to the effect as, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Later on, she again closed the door, went back into her room, didn't investigate. She opened her door for a third time after she heard crying and saw a figure clad in black clothing and masks that covered the person's mouth and nose walking towards her. They described this figure as a 5'10" male, not very muscular, athletically built with bushy eyebrows. The roommate said that she was frozen in fear as this individual walked directly past her and out the back sliding glass door. Police were able to locate a latent shoe print. A latent shoe print it just simply means just essentially a shoe print that they're able to find essentially in the snow or the dirt there. The shoe print showed a distinct diamond pattern similar to the type of the Vans type shoe. Obviously, this is going to be something that police are going to look for in Bryan Kohberger's home in Pennsylvania, as well as any residence that he may have been in Idaho or Washington, so that they can directly tie that shoe back to the case. At this time, the officers, after this, the officers did what's called a video canvass of the area. Video canvass is essentially getting all of the available video surveillance that they may be able to locate, whether that be from homes, businesses, schools, anything that they can essentially get a hold of, so that they can look and try to develop clues. A part of this video canvass, they're able to identify what was later identified as obviously a white Hyundai sedan, leaving the scene between 3:30 a.m. and 4:20 a.m. Officers were able to kind of track this vehicle based on surveillance video from the University of Washington State University, as well as cameras along that route, and were able to essentially isolate, who that vehicle may have belonged to. They were able to, once they kind of narrowed this path down, they were able to identify Bryan Kohberger as the registered owner of that white Hyundai Sonata, I believe. It says at approximately 5:25 a.m. a white sedan consistent with the description of the suspect vehicle was observed on 5 cameras at Pullman, Washington, and on WSU, Washington State University campus. All of this information is going to be important to the officers and to the prosecutors of the case, because again, they want to directly be able to tie that vehicle to the crime scene. They're going to want to show that it left the crime scene, went back to Washington State University, and eventually drove out to Pennsylvania, where Bryan Kohberger was initially arrested. Based on this information, essentially identifying who the vehicle belonged to, the officers developed probable cause to ask a judge for a search warrant of Bryan Kohberger's cell phone records, and they were able to essentially map out his location during the days and weeks leading up to the murders that took place. Obviously, they did a background check of Bryan Kohberger. They learned that he was a student at Washington State University. He just completed his master's degree in criminology and was pursuing his PhD in criminology. Forgive me if I'm kind of slowing down. I'm reading this as I'm explaining it to you. On December 23rd, they applied for and were granted a search warrant of historical phone records between November 12th at 12 a.m. and November 14th at 12 a.m. for a particular phone that they believed was owned by Bryan Kohberger. Which this phone was actually subpoenaed the records from AT&T. The phone was subscribed to by Bryan Kohberger with an address in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, which would lead the officers to that home in Pennsylvania. One of the more interesting things that was found, or that police did in this case, has to do with the DNA evidence. Trying to scroll up to the part where they talk about it specifically. On December 27th of 2022, so just a week ago, Pennsylvania agents, either with the Federal Bureau of FBI or Pennsylvania State Police, actually recovered trash from the Kohberger family residence located in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. That evidence was sent to the state lab for testing. On December 28th, just 3 days later, which is extremely fast, the Idaho State Lab reported that the DNA profile obtained from the trash and the DNA profile obtained from the sheath identified a male as not being excluded as the biological father of the suspect. So basically what that said is the DNA that they recovered from the trash of the Kohberger residence matched the DNA of what would be the father of the DNA that was located on the scene of the sheath of the knife sheath. And this is really the killer part. Excuse my language, but at least 99.9998% of the male population would be expected to be excluded from the possibility of being the suspect's biological father. So what they have here now is DNA evidence from Bryan Kohberger's father. And that DNA evidence is 99.99998 similar to the DNA evidence that was located in the scene of Moscow, Idaho. So basically what they know is that the son of Bryan Kohberger's father, whoever that may be, was essentially the person who left their DNA behind on that knife sheath. Now that doesn't mean that he committed any murders. That doesn't mean anything other than the fact that there was DNA located on the sheath of the knife in very close proximity to where the murders occurred. Obviously this is very, very damning evidence for Bryan Kohberger, and it is really, really tough to come back. In the cases that I've handled that have involved DNA, probably 100 or so, the DNA labs will give you a sort of a ratio of the population to be excluded from that particular sample. When you get a match, essentially 99.9998, that's a match. The statistical probability that DNA belongs to someone else other than Bryan Kohberger would be 1 in multiple quadrillions. So we're not talking about millions, we're not talking about billions, we're not talking about trillions, we're talking about quadrillions to 1. So there's really not going to be much that you can combat saying that that's not my DNA. It's there, it's your DNA. The biggest issue is now, how do we tie Bryan Kohberger to the scene? And this is where all the other evidence becomes so much more important. The vehicle tracking, the cell phone tracking. They developed a map of what they believed the cell phone track to be during that time of day. Testimony of the eyewitnesses, testimony of people just regarding Bryan Kohberger in general, where he was that day, if he had, what his friends saw him doing, whether or not they saw him purchase anything. Police are going to do an extensive investigation to try to figure out where this knife came from. They are going to search that Kohberger residence up and down, and they're going to pull out anything that they believe to be of evidentiary value. The next thing that's going to happen is Bryan Kohberger is not obligated to provide his DNA specifically. However, a judge in this case will order it. The prosecutors will request that a judge order that his DNA be obtained so that they can match his specific DNA against the DNA that was found on the knife, or the sheath of the knife, so that they can know for certain that that was his DNA that was left on the sheath of the knife. What happens is the judge signs an order. They'll go over to the jail, they'll do a little swab inside the mouth, they'll take it, they'll run it for testing, and they'll compare it to the DNA that was found at the scene to the DNA that was obtained from Bryan Kohberger, which will be probably in the next couple of days. To be honest with you, I was fairly skeptical of whether or not DNA evidence would play a large part in this case, because there was so much other potential contaminating factors for that DNA, blood, just people at the scene. The home was kind of known as a party house where people had come and gone in the past, so there's going to be DNA from other people there. The question becomes is, did Bryan Kohberger have any relationship with these people beforehand? Was he friendly with them? Did he know them? Was he ever at their house before? Because that's going to be a central part to this case. The other issue is whether or not, what his defense is going to argue is whether or not, just because his DNA is at the scene, they're going to look at the amount that was recovered. They're going to look at how it was recovered. Granted, it's not found in a very normal place. It's found on the button of a knife sheath that was most likely used to murder 4 people. But the key is going to be tying Bryan Kohberger to the scene through other evidence. As I said before, the DNA is the DNA. It shows that yes, that's his DNA. yes, it was found on the sheath of the knife that was located in the home. But the key for the investigators and for the prosecution is to tie Bryan Kohberger through other evidence back to the scene of the crime. Really from first glance, and a lot of times just a review of affidavits in support of search warrants. They're written in a biased sort of way. They're written by police who want to get a search warrant, who want to get an arrest warrant. So of course they're gonna sound skewed more one way to the other. But really, as it seems right now, this is going to be a tough case for Bryan Kohberger, because it really seems like, for whatever criticism Moscow PD may have received in the past, from what I can gather, they really did their part in investigating this case. They had a suspect fairly early on. They didn't want to make that suspect known, because once a suspect knows about it, then obviously they're not going to stick around. They're going to go to other attempts to evade capture or just to hide. So they're not going to make that information public. The only time they want to make that information public is when they don't really have a solid lead as to the suspect, and they want to kind of bait him coming forward. In this case, they really knew who the suspect was, and they were waiting to gather that other evidence that they could just really trap him. And that's exactly what they did in this case. They got the evidence back on December 28th. I think he was arrested the next day, if I'm not mistaken, December 29th, and was taken into custody in Pennsylvania and was extradited back to Idaho 4 days later. So the criticism of Idaho Police Department in this case, in my experience, wasn't warranted, because they're really doing everything that they can with the information that they had available to them to make sure that they have the most solid case available to them when they went to execute that search warrant and arrest warrant for Bryan Kohberger. As I mentioned before, my name is Michael Rank. I'm a criminal defense attorney in Jacksonville, Florida. As this case just begins, I'm going to be following along and updating you with the trial, the preliminary hearings, and explaining just the general public kind of how it works. So if you found any of this information beneficial or useful, please like, comment, and subscribe so that other people can find this channel and they can learn about this case in a little bit more detail. If you have any questions, you can certainly email me at michael@makeitrankin.com, or you can head to my website at makeitrankin.com as well. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.